My name's Sean. I'm a data engineer at Prefect, and if you've never heard of Prefect, we build a Python-based orchestration framework. Think ETL, data pipelines, ML, DS, all those kind of typical Python workloads for pushing data around. And today I wanted to talk about kind of my process on the adoption curve for tooling like LLMs and MCP servers, and how that's kind of changed the way that my day-to-day work is and how I think things are going to be going forward. So just really quick to see how long I should dally on individual tools or subjects. Like, can I just get a quick show of hands for anyone who's used Claude Code or a Codex or like an agentic coding framework? Cool. What about like dbt or SQL? A lot of folks. And then what about an MCP server or client? So some, not too many. Don't worry about it. I've never given a talk at a conference either, so we're all in the same boat, and I'm rooting for you. So I think the kind of beginning of this is couched in the question of why data engineering, and specifically in this subcontext about things that live in data warehouses, might differ from traditional software engineering practices, and if there's anything that we can learn from them to kind of close the gap or the chasm between how effective LLMs are outright for kind of traditional coding tasks or as compared to stuff in the data warehouse. So you can ignore the actual benchmark, but the idea here is that it's very easy for me, in my experience, to write something that's more Python-driven and implement that. So writing an MCP server can actually be easier than writing what would be considered a pretty easy SQL query with an LLM. And I'll go through kind of why that's been for me. And so I started with just a very simple use a model, one shot in the context of a smart autocomplete. So think Copilot, Cursor, but it falls on its face immediately when you ask it to do things like, how many users do we have? And it will create a select statement that uses an ID that doesn't exist. And we probably don't even have a table called users either. So it's immediately not helpful and results in you coming back and editing. The next thing is that it isn't type aware, so you might have a column called created and it might infer or guess that it's a timestamp or a date, but if it's loaded as a string, there's no way to handle that up front, and it fails immediately. And then even if it gets it right and selects the right things, it might choose the wrong SQL dialect. So if it doesn't know that you're using Snowflake or BigQuery, it might give you a MySQL query or a Snowflake query and fail. And that's before the other ways that this can kind of fall apart. So, and that's in business logic. So think if we have two users who sign up and they use different emails only technically, so you can think capitalization or the plus, is that two users or is that one user? And how do we expect just a simple LLM approach to handle that? And then you get into more complex things like conversion. Did someone convert when they signed up? Did someone convert when they paid us money? And then if you go down the rabbit hole of something like attribution, you're just absolutely going to have a very bad time. So I think the unifying theme there is that like it can write good SQL out of the box, GPT-5 or whichever LLM you choose, but unless it has enough context about what it needs to do, it will not work for you and it'll be counterproductive. And going back to the data engineering context in the sense of a warehouse, we have disparate systems where all of the information about the columns, the tables, what's available, and the types of that information, so the typing, is in a remote warehouse and not in an LLM, or like not in the code base where it might be typically in a class in Python or an ORM. So adopting this, it was a lot of manual fixes, and I don't think it improved my efficiency at all. Maybe if it did, it was ambiguously very small, which led me to kind of use it less and go back to just writing things by hand, if you can imagine. And then the big shift in productivity for me came from moving to Claude Code, and that could be kind of any agentic tool that has access to your repository and the ability to invoke commands or iterate when it sees that a test fails and come back and try it again. So this is Anthropic's definition, but this idea that it has more context and can keep working on problems can be extremely helpful. So in this sense, if Claude Code now can iterate, but it can also read the context out of other files in the directory or reach out to docs if it needs to, for example, I tried to move the context from the data warehouse to the repository. And this has kind of led to a shift in the style guide for SQL and how we do things. Try to avoid any select star unless the columns are enumerated at some point, so that when Claude goes to parse the upstream file, it knows what's available. And then in the absence of a proper class, I've started to lean much more heavily on the Prefect YAML files, which previously for a data team of one, it's a lot of boilerplate that's very low leverage. But that has changed now because I'm not the only one using it. So things are still not perfect, but I've adopted it at this point such that I no longer really write SQL kind of by hand, and it's more just yelling at Claude to fix things when it gets it wrong, which happens a lot. It's still very frustrating, but so much better. And so that kind of goes into if Claude or whichever LLM is successfully writing the code well enough, that's one part of the process. And now it needs to move into kind of the rest of the development life cycle where you can have the appropriate processes and tooling around that. And where I've found the most effective things for me are Claude.md, which is where you can store a bunch of information that Claude needs to know about the project and the repository. So common commands, what the structure of the repository is, kind of where it should look if it needs more context, and that kind of thing. And this I have found to be the place where you want to spend a lot of time experimenting and iterating, even if it feels like a waste of time, because its impact is felt across every single prompt or time you ask Claude to do something. The other thing that's been very effective is switching to planning mode, which is similar to saying think hard or ultra think to Claude, and I'm sure is an equivalent in other tools, but telling it a very long, detailed explanation of what you need, not just build me an attribution model, but using these other models, I need to do this, here's how we're going to define it, and I want you to continue to ask me any questions until you have enough information or context to successfully complete the task. And so getting it to ask me things that I failed to specify saves a lot of time compared to letting it actually kind of create the plan and having it me tell you, you guessed wrong, and now we have to undo it. So it's a way to be more efficient. And then the other thing that I've leaned on is writing a plan. So once it's completed its planning portion, I have it write out to a markdown file that says, essentially, this is what we're working on, and these are the steps. And as you complete each step in the to-do list, I want you to update this file documenting our process or progress. And that's because, I'll talk about it later, but if we get to something like compaction, this becomes like a great tool for picking back up where we left off. So now that process is kind of matured a little bit and has become useful, my comparative advantage compared to Claude has shifted such that I need to be spending my time on different things, and if I'm just manually writing SQL, it is inefficient and kind of a disservice to what I'm trying to get done. So planning in the context of working on that plan with Claude, planning on what I want it to look like, the data modeling, and those kinds of higher order things that Claude will fail at immediately is super helpful. And then designing the process. So this is like I'm onboarding, you might call it an intern, or you might call it a new engineer or a junior engineer, but anything that anyone else would need to do to work on this project, I need to formalize that and make sure that Claude has that context so it can be effective. The other thing is that I spend more time either telling Claude to test things and then validating its testing, because it'll try to do things like delete a column if it's failing a test, and then all the tests are passing because it can't run that one or something like that. And then doing a ton of code review, because if you didn't kind of handcraft it and you don't have the kind of prior knowledge of what's in there, it's really easy to just let Claude have some really weird code slide through, and it's not good. It's embarrassing to deal with after the fact. So, and then I try to delegate all of the actual, obviously, writing, but the testing and the linting and the iterating on that. So, yeah, you do have to plan for the way Claude fails and be as explicit as possible. So this is all a very low-level practical. You could leave and do all this kind of stuff this week, but as a small detour, last year Chris White was here from Prefect, and he gave a talk about design patterns for resilient data pipelines, and that's held up really well and is a very useful higher order way of thinking about things. So at this point, starting from failing with autocomplete and out of the gate, we're continuing to shift failure to the left. So now we might have really effective code being written, but if you get into the nuances of a DBT package or trying to use DBT's node selection, the graph selection criteria, it might fall on its face. So still productive, still not perfect. And so I had the impulse to say, great, I'm going to shove all of the DBT docs around selection, all of the DBT docs around using packages, et cetera, all into the context window at once. And it kind of flooded it. I don't know if you can read this, but this is the output of the context window from the model I'm using and how much is being consumed by different parts. So this might be after 20 or 30 minutes of working, you can already see that the messages are starting to clog up the context. But overloading like that is actually counterproductive, because as the context fills up, in my experience, performance has been worse. So if I work on one DBT model, an hour ago and keep going, and then I get the context window full and I'm working on this model, it might want to go run that model from an hour ago again without me asking it to do anything like that. And then the most frustrating thing of all is compaction, where once the window fills up, Claude tries to get a lower fidelity, fewer token utilization history of the existing context window, and it feels like starting from scratch. And it's very annoying to be in the middle of a long process and feel like you're starting over, which is again why that plan, if you continue to use it and update the to-dos, you can just tell Claude to read the plan again, and it's kind of a way to get rid of the cold start of a brand new post-compaction world. So if overloading is counterproductive because it floods the context window and leads to compaction, the work is the focus that I've had is kind of shifted towards context curation. So focusing really hard on what tokens I want to expose and use with Claude Code. So just a quick definition, because it sounds like most folks haven't used MCP, so apologies if this is repetitive, but I won't read it, but it's basically a standard or a protocol that lets Claude reach out into the world and get context that it might not otherwise have had. There's a lot of nuance that I'm glossing over, but for kind of what I want to talk about in terms of how it's affected my workflows, that's what I want to think about, is how can it reach out into my data warehouse or my other projects or documentation or resources and help itself continue to work. So as I work on the DBT project, I then have another kind of IDE session open to start working on an MCP server that then I can attach to Claude as it's working on DBT. So there's a lot in there. I don't know if you can read all of it, but generally you can think about down at the bottom, the BigQuery table info. That's if I don't have the types in the YAML in DBT or the typing is wrong or mismatched, I can say, go get the information schema for this object from the actual warehouse, and that will inform dbt or Claude effectively. There are other things like a dry run, because BigQuery has very odd behavior around pruning partitions and nested queries. I could have a one query that I think would cost under $1 and it might cost $1,200. So that's kind of a dangerous guardrail that I've got Claude to implement. And then the big one that I'll talk about after is the get the flow run logs at the bottom. And then the resources that I built are essentially like curated, condensed markdown files for issues that I've had with Claude already. So it's just kind of a organic, iterative. It fails at node selection and it fails at JSON functions because it wants to use deprecated JSON functions for some reason. And so I've just tried to build around its deficiencies. And so my favorite moment of, oh wow, everything's kind of changed for me, is debugging stuff that goes wrong in production. So this is an alert that we would get from Prefect Cloud if I did something wrong and our dbt runner failed. And normally I would log in and go for the logs and try to find out what actually went wrong. Was it infrastructure? Was it code? Was it just stale data? What's really going on? But instead, now I take that UID out of Slack and I paste it into Claude code and I say, get the error level or above logs from this flow run and tell me if it's a problem with my code, and if it's a problem with my code, your code, fix it. And so just being able to post that and have Claude start to fix things before you've actually done the hard work of parsing logs and figuring out what's going on, and having those tests start to pass again is kind of a wow moment that has been really cool. So compared to where I started on this adoption of 6 months ago, things are still not perfect. Claude can still be very frustrating. It can have lots of problems, but in general, it's so much easier to work faster, have better testing, faster debugging, improve cycle times. And the cool thing about working in these MCP tools is that it's durable work. So now I can continue to reuse that tool instead of spending that time going in and trying to find the logs every single time. So I'm not saying this is a best practice, but I'm just saying that's what's been productive for me. And so now I've kind of moved into this plateau of productivity, and the next thing that I want to touch on is kind of, okay, now I have a hammer, what other nails are out there to use? And so I did a project, and initially I would think, okay, I'll reach for a dashboard and build that so people have this information at hand. But now I'm wondering if instead of building a dashboard and focusing on how things are sorted and presented and all of that, if I can just find a way to expose that to our go-to-market or sales and success folks, can I make their jobs easier or more efficient as well? So I've started experimenting and iterating with them about what tools might save them time. So if someone writes in from an email and you don't know the ID for their account, they can just pop open whichever LLM they're using or MCP client in that context and say which accounts are associated with this email. You can look for recent pylon issues and that kind of thing. And then I've built a prompt that is, again, like a durable product that can be reused to say, now that you have all of this information or context about these accounts and you know what they're doing, you know if they have issues, you know if there's upcoming opportunities, and it has access to kind of the churn risk modeling, you can get in a summary of how things are going for that account and what their activity's been like or trending like, and should we be concerned about it. And so the weird thing is, instead of building a dashboard, I think you could call that prompt a data product if you want to blend definitions, but I see the lines between kind of the traditional data product and internal tooling work blurring quite a bit, which makes me think, what's the next step? Can I take that information and put it into an agentic workflow that doesn't require the CSM or whoever to kind of manually do this kind of stuff. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave it, because it's kind of in the middle of work that's in progress. Like this is not a completed arc, but having seen the benefits in my own work, I'm now trying to apply that to other patterns in the organization. And then, I don't know if anyone's been to a talk today that has talked about this open semantic interchange, but I just saw that got dropped yesterday, so now I'm wondering if this work's gonna change dramatically again. And I think that's kind of the key takeaway, that everything is changing so quickly that we just have to experiment to kind of keep up and find productive things and be effective. So I'm not going to do a live Q&A, but if you want to find me afterwards, I'll hang around. And if not, feel free to come visit the booth. And then the last thing I'll mention is, while we're over here, because we're US-based, we are hiring for a post-sales solutions engineer in a roughly UTC time zone. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.